Hi there, Steve Kaufman here again in this series of Steve's Summer Sessions, where I ask you to send in your questions about language learning or about LINC, and also I should add in any language that I can answer. I'm quite happy to answer questions in languages other than English as long as I speak them. The questions, I've asked you to submit them through Twitter at hashtags AskSteve. Now today I want to answer some questions that I've received that relate to fluency. Questions such as, what is fluency? How do you achieve fluency? How do you achieve fluency in the country where the language is spoken, not in the country where the language is spoken, and so forth. Okay, my definition of fluency is, it's a bit like, are you fit? Okay, you don't have to be a bodybuilder, you don't have to be a marathon runner in order to be fit. I think fluency is a matter of feeling comfortable in the language. Comfortable that you understand most situations, comfortable that you can basically express yourself in most situations, but it doesn't mean that you're perfect. It doesn't mean that your accent is, easily mistaken for a native speaker. It means that you make grammatical mistakes. It means that you occasionally can't find the right word. It means that you may very well have a pronounced accent. My father, who was born in Czechoslovakia, he had a very identifiable accent for most of the 30 years that he lived in Canada, but he was absolutely fluent in English, did business in English, and we have all met people who are very fluent in English and who have certain turns of phrase that are still more or less, reflect their country of origin, or who have accents and who make mistakes. So fluent means to be comfortable in the language. And so in my own case, so then the next question is, can you become fluent if you don't live in the country where the language is spoken? And of course the answer is yes. I was on a speaking tour in China about 8 years ago, and I spoke to students at various universities there, including the, I think it was called the Beijing Waiyue Xueyuan, and also in near Shanghai, the Huadong Shifan Daxue or something, or in Zhejiang, I think it was the Zhejiang Daxue in Hangzhou. And I met all kinds of students who were excellent in English, Japanese, French, and so forth. So these were obviously students who had dedicated themselves to learning the language. So I think it is possible, but it takes an awful lot of work to achieve real fluency, not in the country where the language is spoken. It's a lot easier to do in the country where the language is spoken. But being in the country where the language is spoken doesn't ensure that you're going to become fluent. I lived in Japan for 9 years. I learned Japanese. Most foreigners there didn't bother, or maybe they tried but they didn't succeed. We know lots of immigrants in different countries who lived there for 20 or 30 years and never learned to speak the language properly. So, how do you become fluent? All right, I believe that it takes a lot of work regardless where you are. It takes a lot of the same kinds of things that I talk about all the time. A lot of time with the language, a positive attitude towards the language, wanting to learn the language, liking the language. In my case, a lot of input type activities, a lot of listening and reading, using things that are of interest to me, building up my basic comprehension abilities and my vocabulary, so that you build up your potential to become fluent. However, to be genuinely fluent, and remember, this means to be comfortable in the language. I'll just digress for a second. Every so often I'll put up a video in some language and people say, well, you're no good, you make mistakes. And someone said, to be really fluent in a language, you have to be able to say things like, how do I tie my shoelaces? I can't remember, there was a long list. I think it was a commenter here at YouTube. Of very obscure things that a native speaker can say. I know how to say tie my shoelaces in English, but I don't necessarily know how to say that in other languages that I speak quite well. It doesn't come up. If it doesn't come up very often, you're not going to be used to saying it. You're not going to go and study a whole bunch of possible obscure scenarios. You learn basic vocabulary through following your interests, and the first or second time I have to express myself on how to tie my shoelaces, I'll know how to tie my shoelaces. It's not important. Fluency is just being comfortable in most situations. So, to become comfortable in most situations, I believe eventually you have to speak, and you have to speak a lot, because fluency implies not only that you understand and that you can read, fluency implies that you can express yourself. Not necessarily in writing, because not every situation requires writing, and there's lots of people who are very fluent in languages that, where they don't write. I don't know. I gather that in Ethiopia people are quite multilingual, but I'm sure they don't write in all the different languages that they speak. So writing, to my mind, is not a condition for fluency. It may be a skill that one should train, and it may be required for certain jobs, but it's not an absolute condition of fluency. But speaking comfortably is. So in order to speak comfortably, you have to speak a lot. It's difficult to create a situation where you speak a lot if you're away from the country where the language is spoken. Those students in China, I'm sure they had lots of opportunity to practice their language. They were fully dedicated to the task. But for the average learner like me, who puts in an hour or two a day, I can't simply suspend my normal professional and social activities in order to look for Romanian speakers or Korean speakers and socialize with them all the time. It's just not practical. So, but eventually, if you want to become fluent, you have to speak a lot. Okay, so what does that mean? If I summarize, it means that you should invest a lot of time and effort into building up your passive capacity in the language, which I have done in, say, 13 languages. But if I look at the languages that I'm most fluent in, English obviously, French and Japanese, those are the languages where I have lived in the country where the language is spoken. And so I am much more fluent in those than any others. The next on my list is Mandarin, because I studied it full time, like those students in China. I was at it 7-8 hours a day. But I lived in Hong Kong, which is not a Mandarin speaking environment, so I didn't have that chance to bring it up to the same level as my Japanese. However, I have a very good potential level in Mandarin. I still call myself fluent, although I'm not as good as in Japanese. But if I were to live in China for 3 months, I have a sufficient grounding through my massive input activities that I could bring myself up to quite a high level. Now, next on my list, let's say, is Spanish. I have never lived in a Spanish-speaking country. I have spent at most 1 or 2 weeks in a Spanish-speaking country on a number of different occasions. When I'm there, my Spanish improves. When I go away and I don't speak so often, my Spanish basically goes down a notch, although the potential is still there. And then as you go on to my languages, German, Swedish, Italian, Russian, Czech, I feel that in all of them, including Romanian, where I just visited for 3-4 days, if I had the opportunity to live there for, let's say, 3 months, in any of those countries, Russia, Czech Republic, and so forth, Italy, that I could bring my language ability way up because I would be speaking all the time. So when we talk about fluency, I don't think it's possible, even for Luca and Richard Simcott, who are outstanding polyglots. They can't have all of their languages, totally fine-tuned so that at the drop of a hat, they can just completely feel comfortable in the language. They may have a handful of languages where they are very good and comfortable easily. But then others where they are potentially fluent, and I would still call them fluent, but it would take a week, 2 weeks in the country to really be comfortable. So, how do you get to fluency? It's the same as how you learn languages, in my opinion. A lot of input activities, following your interest, building up your vocabulary, but eventually a lot of speaking. A lot of speaking is more easily done in the country where the language is spoken. But even if you are in the country where the language is spoken, if all you do is speak, if you don't put that effort into increasing your vocabulary, broadening the range of your comprehension, then you'll be like these immigrants who can speak at a certain level, but never really get beyond that level. So even in the country where the language is spoken, you have to put that effort into your input activities, developing that ability to notice the language, the pronunciation, the structures. You have to put the effort in. If you're not in that country where the language is spoken, you would have to put in a lot of time, not only in input, but eventually in talking to people via Skype or otherwise in order to achieve fluency. But the final word is that fluency is not equivalent to being perfect. You don't have to speak with no noticeable accent. You don't have to speak with no mistakes. You don't have to be able to express yourself on every single conceivable situation, including how to tie your shoelaces. There will be situations where you don't understand. You may be fluent and still miss some things while watching a movie. You can still be fluent. So that's my definition of fluency. And that, I hope I've touched on some of the other questions that related to how do we achieve fluency and how do we achieve fluency both in the country where the language is spoken and away from the country where the language is spoken. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Bye for now.